The crowd gathers, restless and eager, outside the grim walls of Smithfield. A man is dragged forward, his body chained, his face battered, his spirit unbroken. That man is William Wallace, the rebel, the outlaw, the hero of Scotland. And today he will die. Not with a swift sword stroke, not with mercy, but with a punishment reserved for the worst of traitors, hanging, drawing, and quartering. Imagine it, the ropes tightening around his neck, the knife carving into flesh, the jeers of the crowd rising like thunder. But before his final breath, before his heart is torn from his chest, there lies a story of rebellion, of courage, of betrayal. Who was William Wallace, and why did England fear him so much they chose the most horrifying death imaginable? Let us begin.
The year is 1270. Scotland is a proud but fragile kingdom, caught between ancient traditions and the looming shadow of a powerful neighbor, England. Castles rise against the rugged hills, clans feud for land, and beneath it all lies a simmering question: who truly rules Scotland? For decades, Scottish kings had held their independence, balancing alliances with France and watching warily as England grew stronger under ambitious monarchs. By the late 13th century, that monarch was Edward I, known to history as the Hammer of the Scots. Ruthless, calculating, and determined, Edward sought not just to conquer land, but to crush the spirit of a nation. When Scotland's King Alexander III died suddenly in 1286, leaving only a young granddaughter, the Maid of Norway, the kingdom spiraled into crisis. Her death in 1290 deepened the chaos. Scotland had no clear heir. Nobles quarreled, claimants fought, and Edward of England stepped in, pretending to be a fair judge, but seizing the opportunity to demand obedience.
By 1296, the tension exploded. Edward invaded Scotland, sacked Berwick, slaughtered thousands, and carried off the Stone of Destiny from Scone Abbey, the sacred coronation stone of Scottish kings. With one act, he declared Scotland no longer a kingdom, but a vassal of England. Yet resistance burned in the hearts of many. Among them rose a man from relatively obscure origins, William Wallace. Not a king, not a noble lord with vast lands, but a knight of lower standing, perhaps even a commoner. Fierce, uncompromising, and driven by vengeance after English soldiers killed his family, Wallace struck back. Scotland, fractured and weary, found in him a rallying figure. He united farmers, clansmen, and warriors under a banner of freedom. His victories at Stirling Bridge in 1297 shook Edward's pride and electrified Scotland. For a moment, the dream of independence felt within reach. But rebellion is never safe. In the shadows lurked betrayal, shifting loyalties, and the iron grip
of an English king who would stop at nothing to make an example of Wallace. This was the world of the late 13th century, a Scotland desperate to breathe free, and an England determined to choke that breath from its throat.
William Wallace's story begins not in the halls of kings, but in the shadows of oppression. Born around 1270, likely in Elderslie, Renfrewshire, Wallace was not groomed for crowns or councils. He was, at first glance, an ordinary man. But in extraordinary times, the ordinary can ignite revolutions. England's grip tightened across Scotland after the invasion of 1296. English sheriffs demanded taxes, garrisons occupied towns. Any who resisted were branded outlaws. Wallace himself, legend says, first drew blood when an English soldier insulted him in Lanark. The insult turned into a fight, the fight into a killing, and soon Wallace was a hunted man. But the hunted became the hunter. Wallace struck like lightning against English patrols, ambushing convoys, cutting down soldiers in narrow glens, and vanishing before reinforcements arrived. Word spread quickly, a tall, fierce Scot who refused to kneel, a rebel who fought not for a crown, but for freedom. By 1297, Wallace was no longer alone. Farmers, outlaws, and minor lords joined his banner. His growing force harassed English supply lines, burned strongholds, and made Scotland's roads unsafe for the occupiers. The climax of this rising storm came at Stirling Bridge, September 11th, 1297. There, Wallace and Andrew Murray led a vastly outnumbered Scottish force against the mighty English army under John de Warenne, Earl of Surrey. The English crossed the narrow wooden bridge over the River Forth, confident of victory. But Wallace waited, patient, calculating. Only when part of the English army had crossed did he strike. With a roar, the Scots charged. The bridge became a trap. Heavy English knights were crushed, drowned, or slaughtered. Panic spread. What was meant to be another English triumph turned into humiliation. The shock echoed across Europe. A common knight, William Wallace, had shattered the English host. For a brief moment, Scotland stood free. Wallace was declared Guardian of Scotland, ruling in the name of the absent king, John Balliol. Yet, glory is a dangerous crown. Wallace's victory humiliated Edward I, and Edward was not a man to forgive humiliation. In 1298, the English king marched north with a massive army. At Falkirk, Wallace's luck faltered. Though his schiltrons of spearmen stood strong against cavalry, English archers tore through them. The Scots broke. Wallace escaped, but his guardianship crumbled. Noble support waned, the rebellion fractured. Still, Wallace did not surrender. For 7 years, he lived as an outlaw, moving in secrecy, striking when he could, slipping through forests and mountains. His very existence defied Edward's rule, and for that the English king swore vengeance. Whispers grew of betrayal. Scotland's nobility, weary of war, sought peace with England. Wallace, the uncompromising rebel, stood in their way. It was only a matter of time before a price was placed on his head and someone reached for the reward. Foreshadowed in every clash was a grim truth. England did not simply want Wallace dead. They wanted him broken, humiliated, erased from memory. A rebel leader who inspired the common folk could not be granted a soldier's death. His punishment would be crafted as a warning, etched into the very flesh of his body. And so the shadow of the scaffold grew darker. The stage was being prepared for a death that would live in infamy. The years after Falkirk were years of shadows. William Wallace moved like a ghost through Scotland's forests and mountains. One winter night, he might strike an English convoy, seizing weapons and food. By dawn, he was gone, leaving only dead soldiers and smoldering wagons. But shadows are lonely places. Wallace was no longer guardian of Scotland. Many nobles, once eager to follow him, had bent the knee to Edward I. The lure of land, wealth, and survival outweighed loyalty to a rebel cause. Wallace, uncompromising and relentless, became an uncomfortable reminder of what they had abandoned. Still, the people whispered his name. Mothers told children of the hero who fought the English. Farmers prayed for him while sowing their fields. To Edward, that was intolerable. A rebel who could inspire the common folk was more dangerous than an army. Wallace had to be silenced forever. By 1305, betrayal was closing in. It came not on the battlefield, but in the quiet treachery of politics. Sir John de Menteith, a Scottish noble, serving as Sheriff of Dumbarton, had Wallace in his grasp. Whether out of ambition, fear of Edward, or cold calculation, Menteith betrayed him. Some say he lured Wallace with promises of safety. Others that Wallace was captured in his sleep. What is certain is this: the chains of England were fastened around his wrists, and his fate was sealed. Dragged south, Wallace entered the heart of his enemy's world. Imagine the journey. Narrow dirt roads winding through hostile villages. Soldiers surrounding their prize. English peasants told tales of Wallace as a savage barbarian, spat at him, cursed his name, hurled stones. Yet witnesses said he walked with his head high, unflinching, his eyes burning with defiance. London in 1305 was a city of power and fear. Its streets bustled with merchants, beggars, and guards. Above them all towered the grey stone of Westminster Hall, where England's rulers judged life and death. It was here, on August 23rd, that Wallace was brought before his enemies. The trial was not justice, it was theater. Charged with treason, Wallace faced Edward's judges. Treason?
against a king he had never sworn allegiance to, against a crown that had invaded his homeland? Wallace declared it plainly. I could not be a traitor to Edward, for I was never his subject. The words rang through the hall, bold and damning, yet they sealed his fate. Edward had not brought Wallace for mercy. He had brought him for spectacle, for a punishment so savage that no Scot would ever again dare rise. The sentence was passed. Wallace was to be hanged, drawn, and quartered.
A punishment reserved for the vilest traitors. A death of unbearable cruelty. A death not meant simply to end a man's life, but to erase his dignity, his very humanity. Outside, the people stirred. Some jeered, eager to see the rebel broken. Others, silently, pitied him. In their hearts, they knew this was no common criminal. This was a man who had defied a king. And in the hush before the execution, a question lingered in the air like smoke. Would Wallace's death end the dream of Scottish freedom, or would it ignite a fire too fierce to quench? The stage was set. The execution ground awaited, and the world would soon witness one of the most horrifying spectacles of medieval punishment. The morning of August 23rd, 1305, dawned heavy and grey over London. Church bells tolled, calling the faithful to prayer. But for William Wallace, there would be no prayers of deliverance. He was dragged from his cell in the Tower of London, shackled in iron chains, his body weakened from imprisonment. Outside, a cart waited, not to carry him in honor, but in humiliation. In medieval custom, a traitor was not permitted to walk proudly to death. He must be paraded like a beast. The crowd swelled as the cart rattled through the streets. Merchants left their stalls, beggars pressed forward, children perched on shoulders to glimpse the infamous Scotsman. Some spat curses, others stared in silence. Wallace's body bore the scars of war and prison, but his eyes, witnesses said, remained unbroken, filled with fire. The cart rolled into Smithfield, an open ground long used for markets and executions. Wooden scaffolds had been erected, ropes coiled like snakes. Soldiers kept the mob at bay. At the center, Wallace was forced down, stripped and bound. The punishment began. First, the hanging. A noose was slipped around his neck, the rope pulled tight. His body lifted, his breath stolen. But this was not meant to kill. Before death could take him, he was cut down, gasping, choking, the world spinning in pain. The crowd roared. Some cheered, others winced. The cruelty was only beginning. Then the drawing. He was stretched out, bound to a wooden hurdle, his body raked and marked. The executioner's knife carved deep, stripping flesh, spilling blood. Still, Wallace did not cry out. His silence became defiance, each gasp of breath a final act of rebellion. Imagine the scene. The crowd, thousands watching, the stench of blood heavy in the air. The man who had defied a king, now reduced to a broken frame of bone and sinew, yet refusing to yield his dignity. Finally, the quartering. His heart and lungs torn from his chest, lifted high for all to see. His body cut into 4 parts, each destined for a different corner of England, nailed to gates and bridges as a warning. His head, crowned with mockery, set upon London Bridge, where ravens circled above the grisly trophy. This was not mere execution. It was spectacle. It was message. It was Edward's way of saying, "This is the fate of rebels." And yet, in the silence that followed, in the horrified stares of many who had cheered, something lingered. Wallace had not begged for mercy. He had not confessed to treason. He died as he had lived, unyielding. The punishment was meant to erase him. Instead, it immortalized him. When the executioner's work was done, London slowly returned to its rhythm. The carts rolled, the merchants reopened their stalls, and the crowd dispersed with stories on their lips. But the image of William Wallace's suffering remained etched in memory. In Scotland, news traveled quickly. Riders carried word of the fate of their hero. His head on London Bridge, his limbs scattered to Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth, grim tokens nailed to gates as warnings. Edward thought this display would break Scotland's spirit, but it did not. For many, Wallace's death was not the silencing of rebellion, it was its fuel. Peasants whispered that Wallace had died with courage. Warriors swore his ghost would walk the glens. Mothers told children not of his capture, but of his defiance. A martyr had been made. And yet there was grief. Scotland was weary. Nobles quarreled, torn between survival and resistance. Some who had once betrayed Wallace carried the stain of guilt in silence. Sir John de Menteith, who delivered him to the English, was forever remembered as the false Menteith, the false Menteith, a name cursed in Scottish memory. Edward I believed he had crushed a rebellion. In truth, he had sown seeds that would grow beyond his reach. Only 9 years later, in 1314, Robert the Bruce would lead Scotland to victory at Bannockburn, securing independence for a time. The cry of freedom that Wallace had kindled did not die with him. It roared louder, stronger, more enduring than Edward could have imagined. In England, some who had watched the execution left uneasy. A punishment so savage, so drawn out, was meant to terrify. But it also revealed the fear of a king who needed such cruelty to destroy one man. To some, Wallace seemed less a traitor, more a symbol. And symbols are harder to kill than men. The streets of London forgot the blood that had soaked into Smithfield's earth, but Scotland did not forget. The image of Wallace's chains, his suffering, and his defiance lived on in song and story. Ballads were sung of his deeds, chronicles remembered his stand, and in every tale his final punishment was not a defeat, it was the price of freedom. Edward had wanted to erase William Wallace. Instead, he had carved his name into eternity. William Wallace's life ended in chains, but his story never did. His body was torn apart, scattered across England as a warning, but instead of erasing him, it transformed him into something far greater than flesh and bone. A man became a legend. A rebel became a martyr. The history of Scotland is filled with kings, nobles, treaties, and wars, yet Wallace stands apart. He had no throne, no army of knights, no wealth to command. What he possessed was conviction, a refusal to bow before tyranny. That conviction lit a fire in the hearts of ordinary men and women, a fire that survived his death and carried into the victories of Robert the Bruce and beyond. His execution revealed the cruelty of power when it feels threatened. Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots, thought to terrify a nation by showing how far he would go to destroy its champion. But cruelty breeds resistance. Wallace's fate became proof that freedom is never granted by kings. It is taken by those brave enough to fight for it. More than 7 centuries later, his story still unsettles us, not only because of the brutality of his death, but because of the unyielding courage with which he met it. He reminds us that there are causes worth suffering for, ideals worth dying for, and that sometimes the strongest weapon a man can wield is his refusal to yield. So, remember the morning of August 23rd, 1305. Remember the crowd, the scaffold, the silence of a dying man who would not call himself a traitor. And ask yourself, if you were in his place, facing the noose, the knife, the quartering blade, would you have had the courage to stand as William Wallace did?